Okay, everyone, I hope the exam has gone well for you. And so I'm hoping you all did as well or better than you did in the last exam. And I was really pleased how the last exam went. So hopefully things on this one went just as well. So I'm doing my best to address all the emails that I have received. And so if you have any more questions, well, hopefully by now you've turned your exam in, but if anything strange happens, let me know. Okay, so what we're focusing on today for Lecture 13 is adaptive radiation. And so we're going to talk about anole lizards. These guys are really cool. We'll talk about fossil record and radiometric dating. We'll talk about the big events on the history of life on Earth, which includes mass extinctions, mammal radiation, the fact that birds really are the last of the dinosaurs, okay, and all sorts of other cool topics today. So adaptive radiation is actually a pretty cool idea, okay, and a cool concept. So basically what happens is you have a single ancestral species and perhaps goes and colonizes a new area, or something along those lines. But the idea is that a single ancestral species will rapidly diversify into many descendants. Okay, so the descendant species then will diverge into genetically different forms because they have different morphologies and they occupy distinct habitats. So how fast is rapid speciation? Well, it can happen pretty quickly because remember we're dealing with generation time here. Now, if you've ever been to Florida, the anole lizards are very often called Izzies, okay, and they are found down there. So they have been studied for different morphology changes, and these can include the dewlap color, their size and shape, the leg length, the toe pad size, all this other good stuff. So there are 6 major categories of anole lizards found on the Caribbean islands, okay, and so they had a very rapid radiation. And once they had this new ecological opportunity on the islands, and so in fact it happened so quickly that it's really only showed as a polytomy on the phylogenetic tree. And of course, if you guys remember, hint hint, a polytomy is when you can't distinguish any further as far as who came about when, because the speciation occurred so quickly that they can't resolve the pattern given the current data. Okay, so different anole species will have different adaptations, and so they live in different parts of their habitat. Some of them will live, on the trunk. Okay, others will live the trunk to the crown. Others will live, mainly the crown. It just depends, and of course, their adaptations help them be better successful in each of these areas. So given this information, what I would like you to do is take a moment again, because I'm wanting to teach you all how to think with regards to multiple choice questions. And so which of these 4 islands do you think acquired anoles most recently? Now, in order to address this question, and the thing we've not really touched on enough in my opinion is time, okay? And so in this particular example, in this particular tree, time is represented on the y-axis. So the further are you up, the further up you are on the axis, the more recently, the patterns could be seen. So given that information, take a moment, address the question, okay, stop lecture here, read through this, and answer to the best of your ability. Okay, so if all went well, hopefully you chose C on the previous slide. And the reason it was C is because Jamaica was the furthest one up along that y-axis, because remember we said time was represented in y from that first common ancestor that was all the way down to the right, and the most recent addition, of course, would have been Jamaica because it was at the furthest up. Okay, so the most recent event. If that doesn't make sense, let me know. Okay, now given what we've talked about so far, okay, what I want you to do now is address this question. So read through it, okay, and choose your best choice, okay, based on what you feel the correct answer is, and then pause lecture. Once you're ready, start lecture up again. Okay, so if all went well, you chose B. Okay, so it's pre-zygotic as we know. Now, by the way, the reason it's used as behavioral isolation rather than mechanical isolation, because I realize you could come up for an argument with that, it's behavioral because the dewlaps are used in a mating dance. Okay, and so of course I would give you that information in addition to the question, and I actually meant to tell you that before this question came up. So that's why it's behavioral. Okay, but yes, if they didn't use it in a mating dance, you could technically think it's mechanical because they use this to attract females, and this is how they find mates of the same species. Okay, so as we're considering the different habitats, okay, you can see an individual from Jamaica and how well that little guy blends into his background, as well as one from Puerto Rico. And you can kind of see how, that little guy blends in. So if they're a twig lizard like Puerto Rico, they have short legs and they live on small twigs. Whereas if they're a trunk lizard, they're going to have long legs and they'll be able to quickly run up and down tree trunks, which is something I'm sure even if I was a lizard, I could not do. So given this information, okay, once again, let's work through a question and have you apply it. Stop lecture, address the question, choose your best answer, and once you're ready, start up again. Okay, so if all went well, you chose ecological isolation, and that should make sense because those that are on the trunk are going to stay on the trunk. Those that are on small twigs are going to stay on small twigs, and so they live in different ecological space. Therefore, that's what's going to isolate them from reproducing with other species. Okay, so again, teaching you how to think and read through multiple choice questions. Oh, look, another practice questions. Pause lecture, read through, choose your best answer, and when you're ready, start up again. Okay, so if we're reading through these, and as we see with multiple choice, my favorite thing to do is process of elimination. Okay, so for A, a new recessive mutation caused shorter legs inherited by all individuals. What? That doesn't even make sense. Okay, for B, the offspring of the original parents developed short legs from climbing in the bushes. Okay, that's Lamarckian evolution, and no. C, some of the offspring from lizards introduced to the island had shorter legs, were more likely to reproduce than their siblings. Ooh, that one sounds pretty promising. And D, hybridization between different lizard species produced lizard with shorter legs. Nah, once again, not really. Okay, so the answer here that should make sense is choice C. Okay, so as we're sitting here thinking about adaptive radiation, okay, and we're considering rapid speciation, what I want you to know is it's associated with either ecological opportunities and or morphological innovations, okay? So most of the time they're branching into a new area, all right? And then as they do, they tend to adapt to that area, so their morphology will change, okay? Two great examples of this, by the way, happen to be as far as the birds go, Hawaiian honey creepers, okay, or Hawaiian silver swords, and those are the plants that are on the right. So the honey creepers are the birds on the left, silver swords are the plants on the right. These are both adaptive radiation. As far as how fast is rapid speciation, you can't put a number on it. It's all relative, okay, but the idea is that it happens so quickly, very often you can't distinguish it on a phylogenetic tree. Sometimes you can if you have the right data, okay, in which case it's incredibly interesting. But a lot of times it's actually hard to pin down, all right? So, and that should make sense if you consider what we talked about so far. Now, the reality is that the phylogeny and the phylogenies that we have and the fossil record, these are the major tools that biologists will use to study the history of life, okay? And so the history of life is incredibly broad, all right? And we try to do the best we can to figure out what the environment was like back there and who evolved when and so forth. The reality is the fossil record is the only source of direct evidence about what prehistoric critters look like. In addition to that, where they lived and when they existed. Okay, so fossils are also used to do what's called calibrate phylogenies, and that means you get an absolute date for when a particular group originated or at the very least existed. All right, fossils place evolutionary events in the context of Earth's history, and Earth's history, by the way, was pretty dynamic, and the environment changed a lot. Okay, and a lot of these fossils are really all over the place. One great example are the White Cliffs of Dover. These cliffs, by the way, are primarily composed of fossilized phytoplankton. These are called forams. So these forams are incredibly interesting. They come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and good stuff. And, they can tell us a lot about the time that they happen to exist just based on the fossils that we have of them. Now, the process of fossilization it's relatively simple and straightforward, but the reality is not many critters become fossils. Okay, in order to become a fossil, the conditions have to be just right, and as we've briefly discussed before, the fossil record is incredibly incomplete. Okay, but when it comes to the process of fossilization, let's talk about one example. So you have a fish, the fish dies, and it sinks to the bottom of the lake. Okay, so the fish starts to decompose and only the bones are left. Well, eventually they are covered with mud. Okay, then millions of years will pass. The mud, eventually you add heat and pressure and that turns to rock. Okay, and then what will happen is over time, the bone matter will change completely into mineral matter, and then the fish is a fossil. Okay, so a lot of different species are pretty well represented in the fossil record. Most of them are not. Okay, there are basically two main types of fossils. One is called a body fossil, and the other is called a trace fossil. Okay, so a body fossil means it's actually direct evidence of that critter. Okay, so it's a fossil bone or a shell. A trace is something like a footprint, a burrow, a track. Okay, something that is indirect evidence of the existence of that creature. So the thing I'd like you to consider is that body fossils are direct evidence. Bones, shells, the actual critter itself, like preserved in ice, like a mammoth. Amber, which, by the way, does not preserve DNA, in case anyone is curious. Don't ever work in ancient DNA and then become a scientist working in ancient DNA and then watch Hollywood movies, because some of them just kill you. Yes, amber does not preserve DNA well at all because it's too porous and oxygen flows through it, if you guys happen to be curious. So the form is preserved, but the actual DNA and the cell composition completely changes. And really, if you try to pull any DNA out of it, it tends to be nothing but contaminated bacteria. Okay, but anyway, back to body fossils. You can have leaves and seeds and petrified wood and all sorts of other good stuff. Now, trace fossils, again, we said this is indirect. You can have tracks, evidence of something being eaten, like holes in the leaves. You can have poop, which is known as coprolite. Burrows, chemical remains, all this other stuff is evidence that something was there, okay, but it is indirect because it's not the critter itself. Now, the entire field of paleontology basically involves the analysis of the fossil record, okay, and you can do this to infer how critters lived back in the day. The thing to remember, it is not a complete record. It's not a complete record. Did I mention it's not a complete record? Okay. So there are limitations of the fossil record. So one of them happens to be habitat bias. All right. Depending upon where your habitat was, you might have stood a good chance to be fossilized. You might not have stood a good chance to be fossilized. Okay. One example I can think of as far as being fossilized, if you're a sedentary, let's say a clam or a bivalve, we have a really good fossil record of those guys because they couldn't escape, mud or dirt if it happened to have a mudslide or something like that. So they're actually incredibly well preserved. Now, mammals are not so much well preserved, okay? And part of the reason is because usually if a mammal died, it was scavenged. All right. There's also a taxonomic bias. There's also a temporal bias. There was, over time, there were some fossils, a lot of fossils in some areas and not many in others. Okay. And then, of course, an abundance bias. So did I mention the fossil record is not complete? Now, we have what we have, and we do the best we can. But something else you have to consider is a lot of fossils that are out there still haven't even been found yet, and they might never be. Okay, so it's not like we can just go down and dig up everything that we think might exist. We have to get lucky as far as where the fossils even are and be able to have access to them. And some of those fossils probably will get destroyed by plate tectonics before they're ever discovered. So let's talk about radioactive decay and geological dating. Okay, now the way this works is that we use radiometric, this is also called radiometric dating, to determine how old fossils and samples and so forth are. Okay, and so basically we use what are called radioisotopes. Now think back to the chemistry that you guys tried to forget long, long ago. Okay, so you all know that carbon is normally found in multiple forms. You have carbon-12, carbon-13, carbon-14. Now carbon-14 is the rarest and it's also radioactive. It is not stable. Okay, what will happen, the carbon-14, known as the radioisotope, also known as the parent product, okay, will decay into something more stable, known as the decay product or the daughter product. Now it does this at a constant rate, okay. The half-life, so I'm reading the table, all right, to you. So radioisotope, that's the parent product. Decay, that's what it turns into, that's the daughter product. The half-life, that's the amount of time it takes for half of the radioisotope in that particular sample to decay. Okay, so it takes, 5,730 years for half of the carbon-14 to decay into nitrogen-14. All right, and so really the useful dating range is anywhere between 100 years and 30,000 years. So for potassium-40, it turns into argon-40. Okay, it takes 1.3 billion years for half of it, for that to happen. So we have all sorts of different radioisotopes that we can actually use to date different items. Okay, so what I want you to see in the graph is there's the isotope, okay, which we've got in the blue is the parent, that's the radioisotope, in the red is the daughter product. And what you do and how you do this is you take a sample and you measure how much parent there is as far as the amount and how much there is of the daughter product, okay? And from that, you know what time it takes for that to decay, and that lets you calculate the years, how many years have gone by, okay? For example, if you have half and half with regards to carbon-14 and nitrogen-14, you know that 5,730 years have gone by. Okay, so hopefully that should make sense. So again, it's a ratio of the parent product to the daughter product. And again, just remember that isotopes, these are they are basically the same element, but they differ in the number of neutrons. So if you've not had chemistry, don't panic. This is a nice introduction, okay? If you have had chemistry, then this should seem like a piece of cake, and all we're going to do in the next couple of questions is ask you to apply this, okay? So you don't have to memorize the table, but you do have to be able to apply it. All right, now speaking of applying something, read through this question. Use uranium-235 to age a fossil that you found. Pull up the slide of the table in the previous slide that I just showed you. We know uranium decays into lead-207 with a half-life of 710 million years. At least I think that's on the slide. If not, you have all the information here that you need to know. Okay, so you find 25% uranium, 75% lead-207. Based on this, how old is the sample? So take your time, read the question. It's not meant to trick you. It's meant to be very straightforward, all right? And then go ahead and answer the question, pause lecture, and then when you're ready, start up again. All right, now going through everything, the answer should be D, okay? So the reason is because, all right, you have 25% uranium and 75% lead-207, okay? So you know that uranium-235 decays into lead-207, okay? So in order for you to get half and half, that's 710 million years, okay? But then what happens is you then have half of the half, which means 25% and 75%, okay, which gives you another 710 million years, which is equal to 1,420 million years, okay? So this hopefully should make sense. If not, let me know. You've gone through two half-lives here, basically. So you're not just down to 50% uranium, okay, because that would be one half-life, and then you lose half of that, which takes you down to 25% uranium, which is why you've gone through two half-lives, otherwise known as 1,420 million years. So let's do one more of these to make sure everything's straightforward, okay? Read through the question, use the table, address the question to the best of your ability, and when you're ready, start up lecture again. Okay, so 3.9 billion years. This should make sense from potassium to argon, which, by the way, is the second line. In case you tried to forget what potassium is for the scientific notation, as well as argon. Okay, so basically you've gone through three half-lives, which means the answer should be D. Okay, so remember, one half-life is 50-50. Two half-lives is 25-75. Three half-lives, which is what 3.9 billion years comes into, is 12.5 and 87.5, okay? So make sure you understand this. You just have to be able to apply it, all right? And hopefully there's a diagram and a list on the next slide that will help this make more sense to you. So here we have a nice little cheat sheet, okay? So number of half-lives, the amount of the radioisotope, the amount of the decay product, again, radioisotope, I always call it the parent product. This was my field long ago, so I'm just more familiar with it. The decay product is the daughter product, okay, and these are the ratios you should have based on the number of half-lives that have gone by. Okay, so I'm not going to lie, this part of the class kills me every year, and this part of lecture kills me every year. And the reason is because I'm basically supposed to sum up 4.6 billion years of evolution and the rest of lecture today, which is pretty much impossible. Now, if y'all like this particular topic and you want to learn more in depth about it, I happen to teach another course called Biology 107 that basically focuses on the evolution of life, where we take an entire semester to go through 4.6 billion years of evolution, and even that isn't enough time. However, let's face it, it's better than one lecture. Okay, so we're going to do the best we can with regards to, you know, 4.6 billion years of evolution. Now, as far as the Earth is concerned, okay, so what they're showing here is the Hadean eon, which is the older one. Then there's the Archean eon and the Proterozoic eon. And these are just, there's the Precambrian time period, and then there's the Cambrian, and then things kind of keep going. So what I want you to get out of this, though, is that if you look at this diagram particularly closely, you can actually see some interesting things going on, even though it's, you know, greatly reduced. So what I want you to know is that continents moved, the Earth has changed dramatically, physically and chemically, oceans have widened and narrowed, gas concentrations have risen and fallen, oxygen levels, by the way, have increased. I always say if you ever invent a time machine, be very careful about how far back you go, because if you go back too far, there's no oxygen. There was even a stage when Earth was completely molten. Okay, and so there were ice ages, and so I want you to basically read through this, okay, and read through this time, this timeline as best as you can. So formation of Earth, first evidence of life, okay, first evidence of having an oxygen-rich environment, the first eukaryotes. Remember, we talked about eukaryotes and prokaryotes, okay? Then we go into the major diversification of the eukaryotic critters and the first animal fossils, which actually used to be relatively boring, you know, back in the day, but would evolve into something pretty amazing, or at least we would like to think so, in this day and age. So we know that Earth formed about 4.5 to 4.6 billion years ago. Okay, during this time period, believe it or not, there was a smaller planet called Theia that would slam into the Earth. And once the Earth had been forming, and then Theia kind of slammed into it, and then a chunk of it would break off and form our moon. Okay, as I said, time machine, be very careful. Don't go back to this time. This is not a good one. Okay, the Earth was also bombarded by meteors. There were volcanoes everywhere. There was no life, because even if there was, it would have been wiped out by the volcanoes or the meteors. Okay, no oxygen. Eventually life would cool, and liquid water would arrive approximately 4.3 billion years ago. So it took a while for things to kind of form and settle down. Okay, so then we hit the Archean eon, which is 4 to 2.5 billion years ago. So the oceans were here. There were still a lot of volcanoes around, okay, but it wasn't as bad. No oxygen in the atmosphere, but the first cells would arrive, okay? There's chemical signals of them about 3.8 billion years ago. The first bacteria would come about 3.5 billion years ago. And the hypothesized origin of photosynthesis, which, if you will recall, a byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, which is why we are very grateful to our photosynthesizing friends, okay, happened about 3.5 billion years ago. And actually, it would be thanks to these guys that we have oxygen in our atmosphere today. And so the next time you guys walk by a tree or see a little pond scum that happens to be photosynthesizing, don't destroy them, thank them, because they're the reason we exist. Okay, then we get to the Proterozoic eon, which is 2.5 billion years to 542 million years ago. Stromatolites would be common, okay, and these guys are basically cyanobacteria that live together in a colony. The atmosphere and ocean surface area would finally become oxygenated. Yay! In fact, there would be what's known as an oxygen catastrophe, because all the critters that could not live in the presence of oxygen would eventually, and those are the extremophiles, by the way, those would eventually be pushed back to areas where there wasn't any oxygen, which you can imagine now is pretty limited, when at one time, before this time, they actually used to dominate the Earth. Okay, so additionally, we had the first eukaryotic cells come about this time, as well as the first animals in the form of sponges, simple little critters, but, you know, at the same time, pretty big deal that they were coming about, because they would eventually give rise to basically everybody else. So basically, here we have a brief history of life, which still gives me a headache. However, it does do a relatively decent job to kind of sum up who lived when and who still exists and the conditions Earth went through. What I want you to do with this, by the way, is read through it. Okay, so read through this, read through all the boxes, make sure the figure makes sense, realize that, you know, the timing of what's actually located where. So the old is, you know, furthest away, and the new is closest to the, you know, closest to you in the slide. And so read through and make sure everything makes sense. Can you tell that this might pop up on the next exam? So the reality is life has been around on Earth for quite a while, but things didn't get interesting until a time period known as the Cambrian explosion. Okay. So this happened approximately 542 million years ago, and the way this worked is that it took a relatively short amount of time for all of these different animal body forms to come about. And there are some crazy, wild, wonderful critters that lived back in the day, according to the fossil record. And some of them are unlike anything we have today, which is why it's so cool. While, some of them might be precursors to many of the critters that we had today. Now, it's called a Cambrian explosion because everything's relative, okay? And so there's this time period based on the Burgess Shale fossils that are found in the British Columbia that it seemed like all these body forms just kind of happened super quickly. The reality is, though, yeah, super quickly on the fossil record, well, that's about 60 million years, okay? So there are several lines of evidence with regards to animal forms, though. Ediacaria fossils are another example. And those are found in the Ediacaria Hills, and then there's the Daoshanto fossils, which are found in China, which also give rise evidence to animal life. But remember, we're really missing a lot of the fossil record, and so we just kind of have to go by what we have and what's been found so far, which suggests things got pretty cool pretty quick. Now, biologists tend to view the Cambrian explosion as adaptive radiations. Ah, you've heard that term before, of animal groups that may have evolved earlier, something, before 542 million years ago. Now, one of my favorite critters that lived during this time period is called hallucigenia. Okay, and the reason it's called that, as you can see here, it's drawn pretty crazy, okay, and it suggests that this is, based on the fossil record, this is what this guy actually looked like, and the scientists who first named it thought it looked like a hallucination from a bad, they used to call them B movies, which, movies that were created back in the day and had a lot of cheesy characters that hopefully, never come to life. In this case, they were actually pretty crazy looking. It's hypothesized, though, that they had spikes on their back for protection and other ways to eke out a living, and, pretty interesting. When it comes to who really were the first animals, okay, so, and by the way, at this point in time, life is only in the oceans, okay, so the choanoflagellates, we said those guys could live cellularly. We talked about them earlier this semester. Isn't it great when everything comes back together in full circle? And so those guys can live singularly, but they also live in sponges, okay? And so we've got the oldest animal fossils, probably the choanoflagellates in the sponges, all right? In which case, the Ediacarian fossils might have had jellyfish, seems to suggest, all right? And then other, animal phyla that would come about, the mollusks, the annelids, the arthropods, and so forth. So when you're looking at shared derived traits of all animals, well, they're multicellular. We know they don't have a cell wall because remember that is those are the plants. Okay, so they also have a gastrula and they also produce collagen. Okay, so these are once again synapomorphies of all animals, and this should make sense. Okay, so important events in the Phanerozoic eon. So this is after, again, the Cambrian explosion. So the plants and fungi would kind of, move up to land. Eventually the arthropods would, which, by the way, plants and fungi move to land first. And then the arthropods, okay, and then the vertebrates. All right, eventually we would join them. And then other major important events, one of the most famous ones being the KT extinction, because once life had progressed to the dinosaurs, we know that meteors would wipe them out. And I like to think of us as fashionably late, okay? But it wouldn't be until about, 100,000, 200,000 years ago that Homo sapiens would finally make our entrance into this, onto this world. And again, fashionably late. Things you should know during these time periods is that there have been 5 mass extinctions, okay, during the Phanerozoic eon. So a mass extinction is when you have a catastrophic planet-wide environmental event where at least 50% or more of your species go extinct within a few million years. Generally what this means is there's a lot of ecological opportunities, so mass extinctions are often followed by adaptive radiation. Once again, applying our term. Now, the other term you need to realize is called background extinction rate, okay? So this is the average rate of extinction over Earth's history. This is when you lose about 1 to 10% of your species, per million years. Now, there's a hypothesis that our humans are causing the next mass extinction, but I would argue that we're also creating a lot of species too, whether we realize it or not. And if you guys are interested, I really need to start writing stuff down. I found this cool article that I'll have you guys read, maybe for extra credit, but it'll give you an appreciation of the role of humans anyway. Perhaps one of the most famous mass extinction events was at the end of the Cretaceous. This is also known as the KT extinction event. And this is the one that would wipe out the dinosaurs as well as many other critters during this time period. Now, this is most likely, at least according to the research, caused by an asteroid impact about 65.5 million years ago. 75% of all species went extinct, okay? And all non-avian dinosaurs would go extinct, okay? So in the 1990s, a crater that seemed to be from the impact was discovered in the Gulf of Mexico, okay? And ultimately what happened is a thin layer of clay sediment that was high in iridium, which normally is only abundant in asteroids but very rare on Earth. That is found in a layer all around the globe right around this time period according to the fossil record, okay? So given that information, it seems very probable that the asteroid is what took out the dinosaurs. So I don't know if any of you have ever visited an asteroid crater before. I will tell you I did go visit one in Arizona many, many years ago. I'm not really sure what I expected to see. I guess I expected to see this big old asteroid. Keep in mind I was pretty young and didn't understand how these things worked. The reality is if Earth gets slammed by an asteroid, there's nothing left but a huge hole. Because the asteroid gets blown into a million different, millions and billions of different pieces, you know, we're talking to dust, okay, because the force is so great. But what is left is a rather large hole, and in fact, that's what they actually found in the Gulf of Mexico, right off the Yucatan Peninsula, okay? And it's believed, according to carbon dating, that this is where the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs slammed into the Earth. So according to the fossil record and the current hypotheses, the asteroid likely caused what was called an impact winter, where there were major dust clouds, which eventually blocked the sunlight, so no photosynthesis for a year, temperature decline of 7 degrees centigrade, okay? And then the asteroid struck a sulfur-rich rock, which caused sulfuric acid rain. You can kind of see why the dinosaurs would go extinct. Again, if you're going to invent a time machine, don't go back here either, because this would not be a pleasant time either. I think it would just be really sad and pretty violent and, you know, not a good spot to be in. So according to the fossil record, the KT extinction removed a lot of species, and eventually that left a lot of space for adaptive radiation. And so those critters that would evolve then and take the place would include the birds, mammals, lizards, snakes, ants, butterflies, teleost fishes, and so many more. Okay, and so you know, mammals did exist in the time of the dinosaurs, but we weren't human, unlike the Flintstones told you. Okay, if you guys ever watched that cartoon, yeah, I know it's really old. However, you know, dinosaurs and man did not coexist at the same time. Mammals did exist back then, but we were trying to hide from getting eaten, you know, by hiding from the dinosaurs. So it would take a while until we could radiate out, and you had to get rid of the dinosaurs first. Now, interestingly enough, it's hypothesized, and there's a lot of pretty good evidence for this, that birds that exist today are the last remnants of the dinosaurs, okay? And so you might be asking yourself, how in the world do we know that? Well, what makes a dinosaur happens to be in the hip bone structure, okay? And you have to have an open acetabulum. In fact, all dinosaurs are classified as dinosaurs because they have this. All dinosaurs initially started out as bipedal, by the way, on 2 legs. Some of them would become so large that they would go back down on 4 legs, but they all at least originated on 2 legs, okay? And having that open acetabulum is what allowed them to do that, and you can imagine 2 legs, some of the benefits, hint, hint, worked for them too, okay? But it's not just this particular hip bone. There's other ways we know that birds seem to be dinosaurs based on the next couple slides. So based on the fossil record, birds have a lot of similarities with what we call theropod dinosaurs, okay? So the shared derived traits, synapomorphies, of all theropods include a wishbone, a semilunate carpal, and hollow pneumatic bones, okay? And it turns out that when you line up an Archaeopteryx skeleton with a pigeon skeleton, there are a whole lot of similarities there, just based on the fossil record alone that suggests these guys are related. But that's not the only evidence. So research has actually gone one step further and conducted several experiments, okay, on birds. So a relatively new study, and the citation's down there if you're interested in it, basically blocked proteins produced on a chicken face, okay? And so when they blocked these proteins, they failed to make beaks and instead made snouts much more similar to their ancestral state, okay? Much more similar to that of the much older critters. And so this in itself is just fascinating. Just think about it. Blocking some proteins would actually alter their face so much that they would no longer have beaks. Now, in this study, once they blocked these proteins, not only did it change the face by no longer making a beak, but it actually changed the palate bones. Okay, so the palate changed as well, making them much more similar to an early dinosaur. How cool is that? I mean, I realize, I always get torn. The scientist in me and the human in me but get torn a lot. So the human in me, feels, oh, those poor chickens. But the scientist in me is like, oh my gosh, that's the coolest thing, okay? To actually have these guys reverting back to an ancestral, more dinosaur trait. By the way, this was only one gene, and it caused changes in more than one trait or several traits, and that's called pleiotropy. Okay, so hint, hint, pleiotropy, single gene causes a change in more than one trait. If you guys take genetics, you will know that trait, know that particular definition like the back of your hand. Now, in addition to all of this, a 130-million-year-old bird fossil was discovered in 2016, and the fossil has a beak but no teeth and feathers, okay? And so they have melanosomes with reptilian-type keratin, which, again, showing that, there was a very old form of these guys around long, long ago. Okay, guys, there are three major lineages of mammals. We have the monotremes, we got the marsupials, and we have the placentals, also known as eutherians, okay? Which group of mammals is most closely related to primates? This should be super easy. Easy, easy, easy. It's the placentals, okay? All right, so lecture today is relatively short, but there's a really awesome video I want you guys to watch, okay? So the video is technically fair game for the next exam. Keep it obvious. Actually, I should have you do extra credit points for watching it. If you watch both segments of the video, I will give, and you write a brief summary of what you found to be the most interesting, I'll give you guys 2 points extra credit. How does that sound? So you can watch just one of them, okay, keeping in mind, well, I'm not sure how I'll do that with the exam yet. I'll have to think about that. But it's David Attenborough, and as I've told you before, I think David Attenborough is awesome. He's the guy that totally got me interested in science when I was a kid. And it's called First Life. If you guys have seen this before, then great. If you've not seen it before, watch it, please. It's a wonderful video. Have a safe day. Stay safe, and I will talk to you in lecture on Friday.